Hey, it's Chase with Oxford Partners. Hope you're doing well. I'm here with Ryan Hartsell, Managing Director. And today we were just talking offline about leases, landlord lease drafted documents, all the tenant perils, all the things that can go wrong, and some of the horror stories. And Ryan and I thought we should probably hit record and talk through some of those. Where did you want to start?
All right, thanks, Chase. So I was joking to you earlier, and I've been joking about this for many years. A lot of our clients view us as glorified apartment locators, where our primary role is to find the property and then negotiate the best rental price, the lease price. We actually do a lot more than that. We're not attorneys. We can't give legal advice, but all we do is negotiate these lease documents for a living. My actual favorite client to get, they're very difficult, is law firms. They're very hard to convince to hire you, but then once they hire you, they'll end up using us multiple times. And so I just want to kind of take the opportunity to visit a little bit about that. There's over 30 provisions that we actually negotiate. We just picked out a few that we wanted to talk about. I guess the first would be the relocation provision.
Yeah, and just before we jump into that, I just wanted to mention, I always like telling people this. When you think about an apartment lease, nobody really negotiates those, right? You just go in, you go sign it, whatever it says is whatever it is. And what's the value on that? Like $20,000 for that entire lease? In our leases, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're talking, in some cases, millions of dollars of lease value. It pays to pay attention to what's in the document. It really is important to look at these provisions. You have to realize that the majority of leases you're signing are landlord attorney drafted. So they're going to vary from somewhat favorable for the landlord to extremely favorable for the landlord. And where we come in is trying to balance that out. So that's what we try to do. So Ryan, you're mentioning the relocation provision. I always say the best relocation provision is the one that's not in there at all. Try to get it removed.
That's right.
That's possible. That's number one, right?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, in my heyday of cold calling, making lots of cold calls, seemed like once a week I would call on a tenant and they'd say they're not going to use their last agent because there's this relocation provision and they got forcibly relocated by their landlord. And so they're upset with their old agent that they didn't negotiate that out of the lease. And so they're happy to talk with you because we're not going to work with them again. And so whenever I'm negotiating those relocation provisions, I make sure that I paper it up, talk about it with my client multiple times, and we do everything that we can to get that thing out of there. I do have this one funny story, a lady that she's running a med spa out of an office building. And we met with her and she had a somewhat decent rate. She thought it was a great rate, but they were month to month and that they were going to maybe they could get forcibly relocated. One, they're month to month, and then also, even if you're not month to month, there's that relocation provision where the landlord can relocate you. And so I was urging them, let's go ahead and negotiate a new lease to get that relocation provision out. She didn't want to do that. So I told her that when the day comes that the landlord relocates you or gives you 30 days notice that you're going to vacate, remember me, call me. And so years went by and I forgot about it. And then a lady calls me and she's just crying on the phone, hey, I'm being forcibly relocated or kicked out of the building. And, it happens to you once and you remember that. So certainly relocation provision is very important. Number one is to make sure that's not in the lease. And then if you can't do that, sometimes smaller tenants, landlords will not agree to that. You at least have to have a right to terminate your lease if the landlord is relocating you and you disagree with the location. So certainly you build teeth in it to where the landlord has to pay for that relocation, replace all your stationery, build it out exactly in the same quality and configuration, same views, same floor or higher. There's all these things that you can negotiate, but the big one is that you have a right to terminate if the landlord comes or should terminate if the landlord comes to
absolutely. Yeah. And if you can't get rid of it and you're putting teeth in it, another one is obviously making sure that the rent doesn't go up, even if the space is larger that they're substituting. And often they'll agree to do that because the reason they want to move you is to accommodate some larger deal and they'd like to keep you in the building knowing it's an inconvenience to the tenant. So at least you can do some things like that to make it a little more palatable, but try to get it removed if you can. What about turnkey versus having a tenant improvement allowance? That's obviously a pretty important item when you're talking dollars and cents. Who's paying for what? Who's signing the contract? What are your thoughts on that?
When we're training our new to business agents, our best practice is to do turnkey only because so much can go wrong when you're working off a tenant improvement allowance, and the landlord would prefer that you work off a tenant improvement allowance for a reason. And so working off a tenant improvement allowance is not always terrible. You just have to really know what you're doing. So if the space doesn't require a lot of renovations, then maybe you can get a high tenant improvement allowance. Then the unused construction dollars can be converted to additional free rent, pay for your fixtures, furniture, and equipment. So that's great. But there's just lots of horror stories when you're working on a TI allowance and it's thin and you sign the lease and then you go from your construction pricing notes to your construction documents. And then all of a sudden you're $5-10 a foot, sometimes could be $200,000, $150,000, $50,000 over your allowance. And usually that's because there's more information in the construction documents that weren't in the pricing notes that contractors didn't know, that you can oftentimes get so tired of, oh, they over-engineered the space. Go back to the architect and see if they can fix it. Maybe there's a VAV box in the ceiling grid that needs to be replaced. Maybe there's an increase in construction costs. Obviously, that's happened a lot, unfortunately, in the last few years.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have to really know what you're doing. And then also the thing that's wild to me, it always just really gets my blood boiling, is a landlord will offer a turnkey allowance up to a dollar amount. So turnkey allowance up to $20 a foot.
Oh, that's an oldie but a goodie for sure.
That's not a turnkey arrangement at all. The devil's in the details, unfortunately, and there's a lot of details in these leases that you have to pay attention to.
Certainly, yeah. And I actually had a client go through that where, we had a budget in mind and we had a bid and then we had pretty good solid numbers everybody felt pretty comfortable with, including a project manager for the landlord side that was on top of it. But when the electricians got into the space and started looking at the age of the old lighting they had in there, they realized they weren't going to be able to swap out some bulbs. They were going to have to go through and replace all of the ceiling grid lighting with brand new LEDs. There were some energy code enforcement things that were coming into play. They were going to have to do it, couldn't get around it. There were also some HVAC and more MEP type of things that were popping up that you don't always know early in the process. You don't always know with a space plan or even the pricing notes. You don't sometimes know until it's put in front of the county for permitting or when the engineers are doing their planning or the construction documents are being put together. Right. Lots of surprises.
You gotta be careful too. Now that I'm just remembering was why we have that senior junior kind of structure at our firm. A lot of the times a landlord will just present a bid. Let's say it's an $18 per square foot bid and we have a $20 allowance. Okay, we're good to go. They're very happy for you to sign on the dotted line and move the thing forward. They left out $6 of soft costs for the architectural drawings and the permits and the project management fees, and then all of a sudden you're out of pocket. That's just definitely one of the top ones you have to look out for when you're negotiating these leases.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Let's see, where do you want to go next?
We can talk about auditing the landlord's books. That's one of my favorite stories. So we make sure that a tenant has the ability to audit the landlord's books come springtime when the operating expense reconciliation statements come out. And unfortunately, that right is not always in the lease. It should be. And most landlords are good actors for the most part with this provision, but they're certainly the bad actors. And I'm recently representing a wealth advisor. I didn't represent the original lease. I'm just working with him on the expansion. And he's in a building that should be $11 probably a foot in operating expenses. And they're coming in at like almost $15 a foot. And we're like, what's going on? Yeah. And so word on the street is that the landlord's employees and the owner is actually making 401 contributions, making that inside the operating expenses, and they're actually billing some of their vacations inside the operating expenses and then passing that on to the tenants, which is one of my more dramatic stories. But a couple of years ago, one of my engineering clients, we had a right to audit the landlord's books, and some of those operating expense escalations weren't making sense. So we started digging into it. And long story short, this company was using their internal employees, to dispute property taxes for the property over the last 5 years. And supposedly that they were successful for taxes that were assessed 5 years ago. And so this landlord paid their internal employees a tax savings rebate fee of 33%. So 33% of these property taxes that they won in the negotiation table were paid to their own internal employees, right? And then they buried those consulting fees inside, not even the property tax section of the lease, because you can put controllable caps on that. And they put it in just a regular operating expense section of the lease, which is totally illegal. You can't do that. And so my client thought they owed $34,000. When it was all said and done, they actually got an $8,000 refund. So
that's a good little swing right there.
And we've even like small things like landlords are able to put their accounting software, for example, as part of the operating expenses. But we've sometimes they have a portfolio of 20 buildings, right? And they put accounting expense for 20 buildings just in one of their buildings, which they happen to own, right? So all kinds of silly things. There's thick, but as you know, Chase, there's thick books written about triple net leases and the different types of lease structures to get the tenants to pay for 100% of the operating expenses. And it's easy, you'd be forgiven to believe that this whole thing is a racket, which sometimes it feels like it is.
Yeah, certainly. And just to dovetail on this, when you have those rights, you need to make sure you have that right as the tenant in the lease to be able to audit those books. And you want some timeframes in there to protect you. When are they delivering that to you? How long after they delivered it to you do you have to review it and let them know if you plan on auditing it? Making sure you have access to the landlord's books and under what conditions and where. Making sure you are allowed to hire a third party, a CPA, to be able to review those. And then under what conditions do you have the landlord pay for that audit if there's been some discrepancy over a certain percentage? And then if there is an overpayment or an underpayment, how's that handled? So all of that should be addressed in the lease. You want that handled. And some leases, like you said, will just not have it in there at all. Some will have it in there, but it's very vague, to the tenant's detriment in this case. And then obviously you want it to be more specific whenever you can. Tenants insurance. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's really a quick one. You don't really need a lot of coverage, right? So usually 2 million aggregate, 1 million per occurrence is the type of insurance that you would need to bolster a commercial lease. And these things can be this long, basically to say that, which is always funny. Sometimes the landlord will say something in one 5-sentence paragraph, and other times it's 3 pages. It's the 3-page ones you have to be really careful about. But somewhere towards the bottom, you'll have the regular, or maybe it was 3 million aggregate, 2 million per occurrence. You negotiate that down just to save a little bit of money. But then somewhere down the bottom hidden is a $10 million umbrella policy or a $5 million umbrella policy that can be notable. And you just have to know to strike that. It's quick way to save a buck. But a lot of landlords will have that. And it's completely unnecessary for most of our clients and most business operators. It's just completely unnecessary. But it's there. Why not? Landlords, more insurance, the better.
Yeah, I think if they've got enough multiple locations within a portfolio as a tenant and they have an umbrella policy that applies to multiple locations, then certainly that might save them some money to share that umbrella policy across multiple locations. But if you only have one, or you maybe only have two, and you can get away with a simple commercial general liability policy, like you said, 2 million or 3 million in the aggregate, 1 million per occurrence, done. That's certainly going to be cheaper. It's going to be simpler for the tenant. And it's just a little thing that you can look at to save some money and make sure that you're not overpaying, making sure there's not extra professional liability or business interruption or other types of policies that maybe they don't feel like carrying and they're not required to carry and they don't want them. It's important to look for. Events of casualty. This is an interesting thing. So we're talking about some type of fire or an earthquake or some type of damage to the building. Could be a partial or a total destruction of the building. Could be partial or total destruction of the actual lease space. What do you think about events of casualty? What are some things that you typically look for?
Obviously, going back to the insurance part of it and why you would want a building overinsured, sometimes insurance policy would cover for rental loss. So you would have to pay during that event of casualty when you're working from home or when you have temporary space. We want to negotiate that out because we want the landlord abating the rent during that casualty period, because you're not using the space. You're only partially using the space, obviously, but also that kind of puts a little bit of sting in it to make sure the landlord's doing everything that it needs to do to restore the premises as soon as possible. But the timeline is obviously important. What we really go for, and this has happened to me once, one of my software IT clients, there was an event of casualty in their building and they had to move out and it took 9 months and they had to move back in, which was really annoying, right? And then their lease was just coming up 2 years later and they wanted to move to begin with. So it's all this back and forth. And so what we like to do is negotiate, let's say what's typical is 180 days. If there is an event of casualty, the landlord has to estimate within good, reasonable, good faith how long that restoration is going to take. And we like that to be about no more than 180 days. And the event that it's going to take more than 180 days, or it actually does take more than 180 days, which is almost a red line we always add in there. Estimating is not enough. That's good to begin with. But then if it ends up taking more time and on the 190th day, the premises aren't restored, you have an option to terminate your lease. So you're not going back and forth. And so that's very important to negotiate those termination options in the event that something like that happens, that you're just not stuck in temporary space, working from home, and then have to move back. and then years later relocate again. It's just a lot of hassle and expense associated with those type of events.
Yeah, there's a lot of little details in this provision. I've seen leases where it's that 180-day clock starts at the date that the actual event occurred, which is what you want. But I've also seen it written that it's the date that you notified the landlord or the date that they got the estimate or some other later date that's really vague. It could be an extra month or two added to that timeline. As the tenant, you want as many options to terminate as you can. You mentioned how close are we to the end of the lease? As we always try, and if it's in the last year, if it's within a year of that lease expiring, tenant should have an option to terminate, right? If it's over the 180 days estimated for completion date should be. I always put in there that if the landlord has insufficient insurance proceeds to complete the work or any other reason, then we get an option to terminate. If you can't get the work done, we're not finishing it, we're out of here. So there's this provision always has options for the landlord to terminate and very few for the tenant. And so we're looking to balance that and give them more or less the same rights when it comes to this. So I think that's pretty important.
And then somewhat similar to casualty would be when there's an interruption of essential services, basic services in the building. And so this is a provision that's almost never in the lease that we have to add, that when the landlord, outside of events of force majeure, which is acts of God, things outside of the landlord's control, if there's a stoppage of utilities, if there's a stoppage of janitorial service, if there's a stoppage of elevators, which is a big one, that once that happens, there'd be a period of rental abatement. So you can't really functionally use the space. So why should you have to pay rent? If it's not in there, you're paying rent while it happens. So there's an abatement of rent and then a period of time of there being no restoration. And this happens. It's happening a lot right now, particularly in an office, when a lot of these office landlords are operating under a shoestring budget or negative budget. But if it doesn't get resolved after a period of time, that you can terminate the lease actually. And so that's important. Landlords hate that. They hate it being in there, but it needs to be in there. And then again, devil's in the detail, a popular little insert that the landlord will give it to you. Hope you're not paying attention, but they'll say there's only an abatement of rent. There's only a right to terminate in the event that you're actually not using your space. And that's not always necessarily reasonable. We work with a co-op in this office building, about 35,000 square feet, and they inserted that into the lease. And it was an argument. We ended up winning out. We got it. We had to remove that section because if the elevators aren't working, which is the problem in this case, the elevator service is very unreliable. Some of them have to go up 4, 5, 6 flights of stairs. Now, their business is their livelihood, so they're going to suck it up and they're going to do it. But that's a big pain to be going up the staircase for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months when the elevators aren't working. And then also for this co-op, they actually have a retail presence. And so they have a lot of customers. So they're in their space using it. But their customers, they come, it's not working, I'm getting back in my car and going home. And so you got to really look at the details of these provisions and make sure that the essential services, interruption of essential services is not only there, but that it's actually enforceable and reasonable.
Yeah, and you mentioned shoestring budgets. Certain landlords may be having trouble with the higher vacancy. Maybe the revenue's not as strong for a property. Maybe they're deferring some maintenance. The very first thing you're going to notice is an elevator going down when you've got deferred maintenance. That is the most.
That's the number one thing that happens. That's the number one thing.
Yeah, and of course, it's the most visible to all the tenants. If you're not a first floor tenant, you need that elevator every day. So you notice if one of them's going down. Important to have it in there. So next we had on our list is renewal options. So having them, using them, getting around them. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, typically we say the renewal options aren't needed. If you want to stay in a building, landlord's happy to renew you in place, but there are 10% of the time that you actually want one because there are small tenants and there are large tenants. And maybe you're in a space and you're coming up for renewal and there is your neighbor's larger than you and they mentioned, hey, we want to expand. Or maybe the landlord, for whatever reason, decides they need to change up the tenant mix and you're no longer a fit for the building. You might want to stay in the building, but you have no right. And so it's there to enact it when you want to stay and the landlord wants you gone. And so you have to make sure that you negotiate the proper renewal option. And there's a window of time, typically 6 to 12 months before the lease comes up, that you have rights to renew for 1 or 2 terms beyond the initial term. And then you have to negotiate what fair market value is. And that's a whole other arrangement. And then what happens if you don't agree? And how long do you have to negotiate in good faith? If you can't come up with an agreement, does it go to arbitration? Are you getting third-party appraisers to come up with the fair market value?
All right.
And so those things that we negotiate clearly, and we get all of our language in there that we want. I'm seeing this more and more actually, Chase. And we negotiate the entire thing. At the very end, it says, notwithstanding anything to the contrary or contained herein.
Yep.
Right? In no event, the fair market value rent be less than the last month's rent, which is a joke right now in office, right? Actually, I was with Matt and I completed a transaction for an industrial user, a publicly traded an industrial user, and they had it was warehouse, but they had a very elevated rental rate because because it was a completely shell warehouse. And 50% of the warehouse was office. And typically it's 5-10% of the warehouse is office. This one, they had their headquarters in the warehouse. And so there was a ton of that construction that was amortized into the rate. So the final rental rate was artificially higher
than the market,
than the market rate. And the landlord tried to actually put the screws on us, but we just ended up just letting the renewal option expire to get around it, which is never great. But that you take our chances letting expire, and then we negotiated a fair market value, taking out that amortized because that money has been spent and then returned to the landlord.
Yeah. Always good to get that language out of there if you can. Rather work off of the market, whatever the fair market is. And if you do have to go to an arbitration, I always like it to be commercial real estate brokers, maybe SIOR designated brokers in the market with X number of years experience for the mediation and for determining market value versus an appraiser. And appraisers have a good place in the market for valuations, but I think brokers are going to know the value of the rent better than anybody. Let's talk about terminating, when you need to get out of the lease. I mean, there's some different scenarios where you might want to do that. What are your thoughts?
Again, that's another provision that the landlords hate.
Oh, yeah.
When you probably ask 3 or 4 or 5 times before you finally get it, but it can be customary, could be as a regular course of business to get that termination option in there. There's lots of termination options. It can be a one-time termination option, maybe 3 years into a 5-year lease. It can be an ongoing termination option after a period of time with advance notice. And then you can do special case termination options, like if you lose an essential client or there's a death or disability. So there's lots of different termination options that you can negotiate. The landlords don't like it. Also, the tenants don't necessarily like it when we get it. We always negotiate these termination options. There's a penalty to it, right? You usually have to pay unamortized landlord costs. So there's landlord costs up front to lease you the space. And if you're 3 years into a 5-year lease, the landlord wants to recoup 2/5 of that unamortized cost as a fee. So a lot of the times our clients look at that and some of they'll go, man, that seems like a big termination penalty. It's better than paying 2 more, 3 more, 4 more years of rent. And
Sure.
it's an option, right? And if you need it, you'll be happy to pay it. But really, the way I always push for it is it's a little bit of insurance down the road if you end up needing to renegotiate early, downsize early. I just did that for one of my insurance clients northwest of town. They had 3 years left on their lease, and they had a termination option coming up that they can act in 2 years. They just wanted to give up. They're just 7,000 square foot tenant. They wanted to give up 2,000 square feet. And for sure, the landlord would not have accommodated them. But since we have that termination option, we're like, hey, we'd like to stay in the building. We're happy to add another 5-6 years on the back end, but we need to give back this 2,000 square feet. Please work with us now. We went from a $19 rate to a $17 rate, 7,000 to 5,000 square feet. Please work with us now, and we'll waive this termination option. And so do the math on that. It's smart for the landlord to accommodate you, but if that termination option's not there,
No,
not going to happen.
Yeah. They could work on an expansion as well. If you need more space and they can get it in the building, but you don't like the terms of the expansion, you have an option to go out and go somewhere else, get a nice TI allowance, maybe with some convertible allowance somewhere else. It works on both sides. We only have a few more minutes left today, and I know that we had talking about HVAC and just some different things that come up around that. So I really wanted to get to that. There's a lot that goes into it. Obviously, having a cap on HVAC costs is important. And this is where we're talking about either a single tenant building or a multi-tenant building where you as the tenant have responsibility for the HVAC, right? Obviously, we're not talking about larger office buildings where it's a shared unit for the entire building, but in cases where you as the tenant are on the hook if something goes on, tenants don't always know to be paying attention to that before they sign the lease. How many units are serving this space and what condition are they in? How old are they? What's the useful life of these units. How well have they been maintained in the past? And what's going to happen if one of them breaks down 6 months into my lease? Right? That's important.
Yeah. These leases, they should be a two-way street, but they're not. And they're not at all. And so the standard landlord favored lease,
they're a dark alley,
that the tenant's responsible for the ongoing maintenance of the HVAC unit. So that's fair. So every quarter they have a licensed HVAC technician come out, service the unit or units, make repairs and replacements as needed, and then provide a report. And so that's the tenant's obligation to keep that HVAC unit that maybe the landlord paid, maybe they didn't up front, to keep it in good working order. But if it breaks, that same landlord lease is going to say it's the tenant's responsibility to completely replace it. And that's what it's going to be to start out. So you might be 6 years into a 7-year lease and you have a couple of the HVAC units just break. And so you got to come out of pocket $50,000 to replace the HVAC units. You only got 1 year left. You plan on leaving. That's not really fair. And what we do is negotiate caps on those HVAC replacements. So at any given time, you won't have maybe a certain amount of expense per unit per year. And then beyond that, the landlord is responsible for it.
That's the important part there, per year. I've been seeing people lately try to do per occurrence a lot more.
Yeah.
That's terrible, right? $2,000 per unit per occurrence. So it breaks down 4 times this year. I'm going to spend $8,000 on that unit. Thanks.
Yeah, that's terrible. And then if it breaks, it's completely the tenant's responsibility. And so like worst case, that should be that you pay the amortized portion of that replacement while you're a tenant. So if it's a $10,000 replacement and you got 1 year left and you just pay $1,000 that year, and then you move out and the landlord has to pick up the other $9,000. And then just once you move into the space, obviously that they warranty beyond all of that. And we had all of that, also an extra for a year. The landlord will warranty all the MEPs, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, which includes the HVAC. I just had a 3PL company near the airport. We negotiated a lease, and I'm just calling her doing follow-up, and she mentioned, yeah, it's really annoying that we have to replace this HVAC unit. And I'm like, wait, what? And she didn't know. She didn't remember. The property manager was happy to be like, here, send out the bill. And so obviously a hard stop for a second. I went back and looked, okay, good, Ryan, I did it. I put in that warranty. And so we emailed property manager. They're like, oh, my bad. Who knows if they actually noticed that or if it was a dumb property manager. I don't know. But we got that covered. And so just the small things like that certainly matter.
That's Ryan Hartsell adding value post lease signing. A year down the line. That's good. Yeah, they can add up. Costs can add up for these units. They're not cheap. And if the useful life's 12, 15 years at most, and the unit's already there and you're signing a 5, 7, 10-year lease, there absolutely will be major costs involved. So you got to cap them.
Right.
All right. I think we are about out of time.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
And go ahead and kill it.
We could talk about this all day, but boring work.
We'll make it a series. We'll do a round 2. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Grace. Yep.